I'd like to talk today about the Western and how it led to Red Dead Redemption 2 and Red Dead Online. And I've mentioned before in some of my videos the whole concept of the anti-Western, the revisionist Western. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Western as it was first formulated, the revisionist Western as it started, the spaghetti Western as it really accelerated the revisionist process, and then kind of the decline of the Western as it got mired in revisionist messaging, I guess. And the history of the spaghetti Western in particular is maybe a little bit a condensed version of that, although it had kind of a third chapter that the American Western does not. Although it kind of lacks in some ways the first chapter that the American Western started with. So it's interesting what has happened to the genre. All of them are significant though, because they all contribute to the Western as we know it from Red Dead Redemption. And the Western as we know it from Red Dead Redemption, unfortunately, is saddled with a lot of ideas that have nothing to do with Westerns, have nothing to even do with Americans, and they come from outside and they are based on ideas from outside, and that's part of the problem from an American perspective with relating to it. Now, I'm not saying that I don't relate to Red Dead Redemption, because I think it's actually a pretty fun game and I really enjoy it. In fact, it's the first video game that I've played seriously in, I don't know, close to 10 years, since Knights of the Old Republic probably, and Street Fighter 4. So, I mean, we're going back quite a while before, you can find another video game that I really cared about. The Western started, of course, kind of at the beginning of Hollywood and radio teleplays, when there were still people who remembered the Old West personally, having been there and done that, so to speak. And in fact, many of the initial actors, or at least extras, who were rounded up to make some of the movies and TV shows as later on, well, not necessarily TV shows because that came later, but to make the movies that came out of Hollywood from its early era, were in fact leftover cowboys, and they were cast in those roles because they knew how to do what needed to be done. They knew how to ride horses, they knew how to shoot guns. They knew that stuff because they had done it professionally, so to speak. So pretending to do it for the stage was realistic, because they like I said, they actually knew what they were doing. They knew what had really happened. They knew what was involved. In the early days, the Western was somewhat mythologized, you could say, in the sense that many of the protagonist characters were not only a bit larger than life, but they also kind of were an important vehicle for conveying the story of America to itself, how it came to be, who its people were, what its values and morality was. And that's why you have characters like, and this is a later time period, but still very much kind of when the Western was at its peak. You have characters like many of John Wayne's characters in some of the movies that he did, like the Cowboys, or Rooster Cogburn in the movies he was in, or some of those other characters that he played. A number of other actors were famous for playing those types of cowboys on TV when that came along. This was also particularly noticeable when you had shows like Gunsmoke and Rawhide and Wagon Train and Bonanza. And in many ways, these were somewhat idealized. The characters were, they were good. They were heroic, so to speak. They were protecting the innocent from the dangers of the frontier, which certainly really happened. And in fact, many of these, there's another show which I'm not familiar with, but apparently it was a big deal at the time, called Death Valley Stories, I think is what it was called. And it started off as a radio play, and then later was adapted to be a TV show. And it was based on stories that were told by old cowboys of stuff that they used to do in Southern California when it was, part of the Old West still, so to speak. So, a lot of this stuff was pretty true to life, although it was certainly idealized. And some of this had to do with the Hays Code, which came out, during the Depression, when movies started getting, started offending the public morality, so to speak. And the Hays Code probably overcorrected and made a number of things taboo and off limits, and that was very limiting. But it was also not necessarily a bad thing. Something that most people have forgotten in the current era for at least a couple of generations, but which everybody else from the dawn of human history until the dawn of Hollywood, everybody understood this that people in show business are not good people. They are, in fact, usually there's a reason that they are in that profession, and it often has to do with their corruption, their perversion, or their just inability to fit into society. And everybody kind of always knew this, and then everybody kind of forgot it in the current era as we see a lot of the unraveling of the mystique of Hollywood in the last couple of years, not only with Me Too, which is kind of an ironic movement in some sense, because it only exposes the male corruption. It doesn't expose the female corruption, and it casts all women as victims, which certainly is not true. But a lot of this stuff is still, it's starting to come out, and we're starting to see, as celebrities are trying to get more in touch with their fans via social media, especially during this lockdown situation, they're coming across as just completely bizarre people who have nothing in common with regular people, and that was always true. And so that was part of the problem, and that's why the Hays Code went into effect. The Hays Code impacted the Western, of course, because the golden age of the Western was pretty much during the Hays Code period. So there were limitations in terms of what the Westerns could show, but there were also some limitations on what they wanted to show, because like I said, it was the mythologizing of them in some degree. It was telling a story of America from the Americans' point of view, and how it came to be. And this is the second founding of America, of course. The first founding was the Founding Fathers. After the Civil War, that America was quite honestly destroyed. It was conquered by a small subset of the other Americans, and they kind of had to tell a new founding mythology. And one of the things that they got right in a lot of these old Westerns is that a lot of the people who went west were ex-Confederate soldiers who, having been displaced because they were militarily conquered, and because their livelihoods, and I'm not talking about plantation owners with big slaves, I'm talking about just average regular Joe people, but their livelihoods, their property, everything was all stolen by the North. And so many of them went west because it was the only land of opportunity that there was for them. Also because they had the ability, it was a way to keep the peace by being able to spread out over a largely empty wilderness. That was how Americans could keep from coming into more conflict again so soon after the Civil War, because the Civil War resolution was not something that anybody in the South certainly was happy about, but many people elsewhere became kind of cynical about it, and they were looking for other places to go. And then there was there had been gold rushes in the past, and there was just this sense that, look, there's this vast empty wilderness between the frontier, which was kind of Kansas, Nebraska, so to speak, Arkansas, maybe a little bit further, Oklahoma, and then the West Coast, where there was some other stuff going on, in California and the Pacific Northwest. In between, there wasn't really much of anything, and it was just seen as largely empty. And there were bandits who ran around in it, because where else were they going to go? There were a handful of Indians who were running around out there, and they were largely hostile and duplicitous. Like they would promise settlers and homesteaders that they would, yeah, sure, settle here, we don't have a problem with it. But then their society was one where they were constantly raiding and murdering and stealing from the settlers, and to them it was just kind of normal. That's just what you do. And to be fair, the Europeans during earlier times had been very similar, and there's kind of like this quote unquote heroic age mentality from the Bronze Age and Iron Age, where that was what Europeans did too, and Vikings were maybe kind of one of the last hurrahs of that, after the rest of Europe had been kind of Christianized and largely relatively tamed. But the Indians had never had that happen, so they were still kind of living in that world where, yeah, sure, we raid the settlement next door, and we kill a few people and steal some of their animals, and nobody sees that as a casus belli. But the Americans had kind of had a different perspective, and they saw the murdering and theft of homesteaders and settlers as just that, something that needed to be responded to in no uncertain terms. And so that was really kind of the story of the decline of the Indian nations. But it's not really accurate to depict the Indian nations as being these vast, populous hordes of people. The American West was and even now to some degree this is still true, although obviously not nearly as much as it was then, but it was very much just kind of an empty place. There was nothing going on there. So anyway, that's why you have stories like Wagon Train and Rawhide, which are all about either drovers or pioneers traveling somewhere but never actually getting there. Because in many ways the stories are kind of about the idea of people on the move in the West looking for someplace to go, and the story is about the journey. So obviously you can't ever get there or the show ends. And so you have stuff like Rawhide, for example, is all about this big cattle drive, the long cattle drive, which is something that obviously no longer still happens, but it was a big deal in the West. And these cowboys would take their cattle from Texas to Wyoming or Montana or whatever, and on the way they would pass pioneers, they would pass through these towns, they would pass people, and people were always kind of needing help or whatever, and they just had these kind of little expositions as they came upon something, and it was the story of the week about what they came across this time while on the drive. And then at the end of the episode they would kind of move on again, and then the next week they would have something different happen. And the same thing happened in Wagon Train. Other shows like Bonanza were set more in one place, and they were kind of more about the building, the homesteaders and the settlers, and trying to make something of the place that they had settled down into. But of course it was still in a pretty wild and relatively rough place, so there were a lot of problems that came along. And that's kind of the story of the Western. And at its most cliched, it was certainly formulaic, and it got to the point, this is especially true in the television shows, it got to the point where it was just repetitive, and it almost got a little bit silly, although it was wildly popular, and Westerns were just wildly popular, and not only in America, but around the world. And there was this kind of the can-do attitude of the Americans, which is a big part of what used to be at least our native personality, was encouraging, and everybody kind of it was I don't know, it was a part of the appeal of the genre, even to people in Europe, for example, who watched a lot of Westerns, because we made a lot of Westerns, and Hollywood was still at this time kind of the only real game in town. There were some other movie cinemas from other nationalities, and there had been some German cinema, and there had been some Italian and French cinema, but they were all very localized. Hollywood was the only one who made movies that were really kind of seen everywhere, and they were by far the biggest movie making production outfit in the world. So this is the Western as we roll into the early 60s, and people think of the 60s and they think of the late 60s. When you remember, the early 60s is really very much like what people think the 50s were. It was still kind of the same up through the mid 50s. Clint Eastwood, in fact, was one of the co-stars of Rawhide, and curiously, his contract allowed him to film Rawhide but not to film any movies in the Hollywood system. It did, however, not forbid him from making movies outside of the Hollywood system and with other companies or with other countries. And this is where we kind of get to the spaghetti western. And before I actually, let me back up just a bit. Before I talk about the spaghetti western, let me talk about some changes that were starting to happen. And we know a little bit more about this because we know about the Hollywood themselves have told us about how terrible the blacklisting and the HUD committee and all that stuff was. The reality is, of course, that they say that because for the most part they did have something to hide. They were anti-American. They were communist agents or sympathizers. It's actually very, very well documented that that was actually 100% true. So rather than admitting it, of course, what they have done is kind of try to flip that and yell at everybody else for even daring to question them, when in reality, everybody else was absolutely right to question them. And so what had happened is that there was starting to become this kind of anti-American sentiment in Hollywood. And you can read about that in places like, Walt Disney fought against it. He was the only studio that really kind of successfully fought against it. But the studios also were still driven by making profit. I don't even believe that's true anymore, but it was at the time. And so they made movies that appealed to Americans, even if privately the people in Hollywood did not have any appreciation for American culture, American history, or the American people even, for that matter. And they made westerns because they were popular, not because they loved them. And what had started gradually to happen was the first stirrings of the anti-Western were coming up. And some of this may have just been too because filmmakers were bored with the formula of the Western, and the Hays Code was kind of starting to loosen its grip, although it wasn't completely repealed. But people were kind of pushing back against it and seeing what they could get away with. And what happened was people kind of started changing up the formula of the Western, and they started being a little bit more sympathetic to the people who weren't even Americans, who were operating on the fringes of the stories, the Mexicans who were jumping across the border, or the Indians, or whoever else who had not historically been the heroes of the Westerns. Now, that doesn't mean that they were necessarily cast as constant villains, contrary to what you may hear. The Americans usually kind of respected the Indians and respected their culture to some degree, even though they certainly saw that in many cases it was opposed to them and stood against what they were trying to build and who they were, and so therefore it had to be fought because the Indians were fighting against them. But they also respected them, and that's exactly why Tonto, for example, was the Lone Ranger's companion instead of some other guy from back east or something like that. The Lone Ranger had an Indian companion because to the writers and the filmmakers and whatnot, the idea of the Americans and the Indians actually finding common ground and working together made perfect sense. It didn't make sense to this new wave of filmmakers, though, who were gradually starting to see the Americans as the problem. And what they wanted to do was constantly criticize America, sometimes very indirectly, by telling stories from the point of view of somebody non-American and making them out like they were the victims of some kind of American oppression. This is largely a narrative that has, we are told that it has this huge, body of evidence that says this is actually what happened, and people think that that's our history. America's kind of stormed out west and oppressed everybody and took over everything. That is largely a narrative that has no basis whatsoever in reality. But it was something that had a lot of resonance with cultural Marxists, and this I don't want to get going on cultural Marxism. You can do a YouTube search and find out plenty about cultural Marxism, some other source. You don't need to have me tell you about that. But it was starting to infect. In Hollywood was one of the early adopters of cultural Marxism, and academia was one of the early adopters of cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism now is just so suffused throughout our daily life that relatively few people even recognize it for what it is, which is exactly why the red pill analogy from the Matrix has been so often used by people who have learned to see through it, because you need to be decommissioned, you need to be deprogrammed, you need to be depropagandized, you need to go find independent confirmations of what people are telling you, when you find out that in many cases what they're telling you is not true. And so it's difficult to take the red pill. There's kind of, in the Matrix, you take it and then suddenly you realize that the whole world is a lie. The reality, of course, is that the red pill is a long process where you uncover one lie after another about what we think and what we have been told, what we learn in school, what we're told in all of our movies, what we're told everywhere that reality in America is. And you find out that a lot of that stuff isn't real, that actually what came before was much more true. Even though it was maybe told more crudely in some ways, because the tools, the subtle tools, weren't yet developed. So cultural Marxism had kind of come in, and it resonated very strongly with the cultural Marxists in Hollywood to let's start kind of deconstructing the Western and turning it into an anti-Western. And the same things were happening in other genres as well. And as this was just kind of starting, it suddenly got jump-started by Sergio Leone and the spaghetti Western. So I guess now it's probably time to turn to them. Sergio Leone, of course, is not an American at all, and neither was his production company. He kind of stumbled across the movie Yojimbo and called one of his buddies who was also in the Italian film industry and said, hey, we can make a Western out of that. Especially he points out that, especially since Yojimbo is itself a retelling of a story by Dashiell Hammett, who, of course, along with Raymond Chandler, is one of the foundational pillars of the noir type of story. So this was automatically going to be something very different than the American Western, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Sergio Leone and the rest of the Italians had gone, they had lived through the fascist regime. They had lived through the deconstruction of Italy during World War II, and there was a lot of economic suffering, I guess you could say, whereas in America we rebounded fairly quickly from World War II and prospered. We prospered in many ways at the expense of the rest of the Western world, because they were so incredibly, destroyed, so to speak. Their economies and their infrastructures were in shambles that, we were the ones that kind of came in and helped them rebuild. And so we prospered. It took them a lot longer to prosper. This was especially true of Leone, who was kind of more of a Southern Italian. And you may or may not know this, but Italy is really, and I'm simplifying a bit, you could say it's even more than this, but it is at least two countries. And when Italy was built as a nation in the 1870s, it was really the combination of two countries, and one was the Piedmont and Sardinia, and one was the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And there's a huge difference between northern and southern Italy, culturally, economically, and in many other ways. And it's almost like the contrast between, and this isn't as true anymore because the invasion of America has turned much of the American Southwest into a de facto colony of Mexico. But if you remember back at the time when there was a clearer distinction between the American and the Mexican sides of the border, it's kind of like that in Italy too. And the northern Italians who have, a lot of Lombardic ancestry and other things. They have a culture that's just very different than the southern Italy. They accept a lot more order, and they are much more prosperous and hardworking. And I don't mean this to be disparaging of Southern Italians, but the Southern Italians are kind of more like the third world in some ways of Italy, and that's the source of all the organized crime, the mafia, and all the other crime families. They're all Southern Italians. They're from Sicily and Cantabria, and the other, not Cantabria, but they're from Sicily and the rest of the southern half of Italy, and that's where the organized crime is, and that's where people are much more. There's a lot more poverty, and there's a lot more, lack of economic opportunity, and people have, largely it's a very different world there. And Leone was a Southern Italian, and there had been a successful film industry in Italy, but it was largely Northern Italian. And so when Leone decided to make A Fistful of Dollars, he cast an American star, Clint Eastwood, who wasn't a star yet, but he was a TV star. He had been on Rawhide for a while, and his contract allowed him to make this movie in a foreign country. And it was an odd production because they went to Spain. The cast was a mixture of Spaniards and Italians, and then Clint Eastwood. A lot of people didn't speak the same language. As the spaghetti westerns evolved, this was even more true, and lots of people from different places in Europe kind of did this, and many of them were literally filmed silently, and all the sound was dubbed in later, especially the dialogue, because people just moved their mouth and said whatever in the language that they spoke, and then they had to dub dialogue on top of them for whichever region the film was going to be shown in. And the spaghetti western, so it came from this perspective of a guy who was not American and didn't have any of that heritage of having, spread out across the West and tamed this wild frontier. His heritage was one of having lived in a place that had been occupied since time immemorial by his people or the predecessors of his people. And it was a place that had undergone a fascist, I don't want to say occupation, because there was Italians who did it, but it had a fascist regime, very totalitarian. It had undergone, this reconstruction after the war and these depressions, and it had been, his whole life had kind of been seeing his country struggle, and he had a very pessimistic worldview compared to the optimistic worldview that was typical for the Westerns. And so he brought that to it. And like I said, although I don't think that he was necessarily trying to make a revisionist Western, in many ways he paralleled the same developments of the revisionist Western. He cast it very differently. It had a lot of Southern Italians and Spaniards. It was filmed in Spain. Much of the places where he expected it to be shown were in Southern Italy. So it was, cast with a bunch of people who didn't look like American actors, with the exception of Clint Eastwood himself. It was filmed in a place that looked kind of almost more like Mexico than like America, and they had a lot of Roman Catholic iconography, which is another part of which makes it feel more Mexican in many ways, because the Americans were traditionally not Catholic and had kind of rejected Catholicism. And I grew up in an America where Southern Baptist and Presbyterian and stuff like that were common. The only Catholics were the Mexicans, who were just kind of starting to show up. I mean, there had been Mexicans in Texas since forever, but they weren't really, the Tejanos weren't really a huge group in Texas. There were many more Americans than there were Tejanos in Texas. And the Tejanos were kind of Mexican. The new Mexicans, who, thanks to Ronald Reagan's amnesty, invited many more to come, they were, of course, Catholic. The Italians and Poles, if there were any, and there were always a few, they were Catholic because they kind of didn't come from the same cultural background as the Americans. And they became legal Americans, and in many cases they intermarried with and their descendants became Americans, but they had totally different cultural context. There's an awful lot of that in the spaghetti westerns, where you see a lot of Roman Catholic iconography, which the Americans would never have done. So that was one of the things that was different. The casting was different. The character was different because of Leone's, in part because of Leone's pessimistic attitude. It was a cynical movie, and Clint Eastwood's character was not a hero like, what was his name? Rowdy, whatever his name was, his character on Rawhide. He was silent, didn't say very much. He was kind of a tough guy who didn't put up with crap from anybody. Wasn't really super nice. He wasn't a bad guy, but he wasn't really a nice guy either. He was kind of much more morally ambiguous. His motivation seemed to be making a fistful of dollars, so to speak, setting the criminal gangs against each other. So he was not a hero, he was an anti-hero. And the setting was just exaggerated wildness, where, shows, some of the John Wayne movies, the John Ford movies, TV shows like Gunsmoke and Rawhide and Wagon Train, sure, they had wildness, but when you ran into people, unless they were outlaws or Indians, they were just typical people, and they maybe had problems that needed to be resolved, or there was something going on in their settlement that needed to be dealt with or whatever. But there wasn't this idea that the entire West was just people running around gunning each other down for no reason whatsoever. Sergio Leone kind of saw the West that way. To him, that was part of the mystique of it, even if it was kind of really only in his own mind. And so that's what he did. And A Fistful of Dollars became a big hit. Of course, his next two movies also were big hits, For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. They were also big hits in America. I mean, it's not like these ideas were completely non-resonant to Americans, because, like I said, in many ways they mirrored some of what had been going on in the noir novels, for example, and elsewhere. And everybody likes a charismatic, tough guy who doesn't put up with any crap, a lone individualist, that kind of thing. So, and he did kind of, in some ways, embody what Americans thought the hero of the West was. Now, sure, he wasn't the Lone Ranger. He wasn't, the head drover of Rawhide. He wasn't, what's his name from Bonanza. He wasn't that kind of hero where he was running around taking care of everybody around him. But he was the kind of guy who took care of himself and was very capable. In many cases, and I've read this from some commentary, and it's a little bit indicting, even though I don't think it necessarily means to be. But it says that, in many cases, the action hero in any genre whatsoever was very strongly influenced by the spaghetti western. This kind of, character who's charismatic, very stylish in many ways, very tough, has shades of edginess or anti-heroic tendencies to him. But it's something that pretty much anybody, no matter what cultural background you come from, can probably relate to some degree. And so it really kind of remade the Western in many ways. And a lot of people, even in America, saw this and they were like, well, that's the kind of Western I want to do, either because they were bored and tired with the traditional Western format, or because they didn't like it because it represented an ideology and a culture that they didn't feel tied to. So they went and they made stuff like, The Wild Bunch and other movies that were kind of more, suddenly now the bad guys were the protagonists. And I think in many ways the Wild Bunch, made in the, 1970, very early 70s, I think, maybe the late 60s, is heavily influenced by the Leone Westerns, but also it's kind of the template, if you will, for the Dutch Van der Linde gang in a lot of ways. And I think that that's where you kind of really can find the clearest indication of where Red Dead Redemption is coming from. The spaghetti western then went on to go do its own thing. They made hundreds of movies a year for, better part of 10 years or more. They went through several phases. This Italian cinema was unusual in the sense that it created these like super cheap and fast movies, and they hit whatever was faddish, and they made literally hundreds of movies of whatever was faddish. And they had gone through like a Hercules sword and sandal phase. After Leone made Fistful of Dollars and it was super popular, they went through a phase where westerns were super popular, but they were European westerns, and more they started to have a European cast, although more and more Americans also saw them as an opportunity, either up and coming, stars who weren't really stars yet, but then wanted to be and thought that that was an opportunity, like it had been for Clint Eastwood, or older stars that weren't getting the roles that they wanted to, could then go get better roles maybe in some of these spaghetti westerns. So there were more and more Americans, but they also started to cast more and more non-Americans. Franco Nero, for example, in the first Django movie, and Corbucci, the director of that, was kind of one of the other, along with Leone, was kind of the other big director of spaghetti westerns for a long time, and he pushed things in lots of different directions too. And it's clear that he had no interest necessarily in making a western for its own sake. He just kind of liked making movies, and the western was a convenient vehicle to do it. And he kind of liked to tell these different kinds of stories, and they were very violent, and they had all these kind of things that were unlike what the western genre was used to. After a while, the spaghetti western became overtly political and Marxist, and there were a whole bunch of spaghetti westerns that are basically communist propaganda pieces. And that was, for a while, that was fine, and this was in the late 60s, early 70s, and that was kind of going on all over the world. It was going on in America too, although we didn't really, our communists still were very careful and hesitant to use that label, because the mainstream thought it was as bad as the Nazis, which it was. In fact, if anything, it was much worse than the Nazis. So nobody wanted to be called a communist, but in reality, that's what they were. They were the cultural Marxists, and their ideology came directly from their communist forebears who had kind of brought it over in the first place. And so that was kind of going on in Italy. It was those movies didn't make it over to America quite as often. And then the final phase of the spaghetti western was basically they were parodying themselves. And this is kind of like the Trinity movies. They Call Me Trinity, My Name Is Nobody, some of that stuff. It kind of went out with a whimper, so to speak, because after having gone through these phases, there was nothing left for them to do other than make fun of themselves, I guess. Kind of odd. But for a long time, this kind of revisionist western, heavily influenced by the spaghetti western, was still going on in Hollywood, and there were a number of movies that were made. There's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Like I said, there was Wild Bunch, and there were a number of others. Clint Eastwood even had a career through the 70s and into the 80s where he started now directing westerns and starring in them both that were American made. But they were more revisionist in their style too. And now we're kind of at the point where people rarely make westerns, and it's been decades since there's been more than a handful of westerns, and most of them are also parodies. I mean, look at, for example, the Armie Hammer and Johnny Depp Lone Ranger. It's just absurd. Everybody hated it, and it was a huge flop. Why? Because the Americans are the bad guys, because the main characters have no likability or charisma, and in fact they're these whiny, entitled, bratty little princesses that nobody can stand. And the story is, and the messaging is all, and it is all about the messaging. There's all these constant digs at America, and the whole story is about how America is ruining whatever was there before Americans came on board. And so it's no surprise, or it shouldn't be, that kind of thing flopped. This was not a flop, but it's kind of got much more subtly the same message. There was something like Dances with Wolves, for example, the oft imitated plot, which was also done in Ferngully, was also done in Pocahontas, was also done in Avatar. It's kind of a very ridiculous plot, and it's kind of insulting, quite honestly, to Americans. But when the movie's done well enough and the messaging is a little more subtle, it's not terrible to watch. The only really good westerns that I can think of, or reasonably good westerns I can think of, that were made, from 1980 on, about the time that I was paying attention, probably like Silverado, Tombstone, maybe the Magnificent Seven and True Grit remakes, although they were a little bit superfluous because the original movies are still really good. So that's kind of where we are with Red Dead. Red Dead comes into the scene. It shows that there's still, and it's not alone, because there was other video games too, like Gun and some others that were super popular. It shows that there's still life left in the concept of the Western, but you need to have people who don't hate the concept of the Western and are trying to deconstruct it, tear it down, flip its narrative on its head, and do that other kind of crap. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do it. And, there's a video I saw on YouTube recently. I can't remember who posted it, but it was, why don't they make Westerns anymore? And it was one of those kind of corporate kind of guys like Looper, somebody like that. I don't remember who it was. But, they had this whole story, this narrative they were telling, and I kind of commented later, says, you missed the main point. I mean, you said a bunch of stuff, and none of it's inaccurate, but you totally missed the point. Hollywood doesn't make Westerns because they're not interested in making Westerns, and when they do make a Western, they hate the Western, and so they insult their audience. And surprise, surprise, people don't want to go see that, so then the movie flops, and then Hollywood concludes that people don't want to see Westerns. When in reality, a good Western, told in the traditional sense, or even a good spaghetti style Western, something influenced by the revisionists but not, dragged through the mud into full revisionist anti-Westernism, would still be good, and it would still be something that people would want to watch. And I think that it needs to be marketed correctly, and it needs to be made correctly, and it can't be, a woke fest, anti-American screed. And unfortunately, almost anything that Hollywood does is that way. The Western kind of just got it a little bit earlier than most other genres, so it died faster. But what we're seeing now is that there's just this massive backlash brewing against Hollywood and what they're doing and what they're selling, and people don't want to buy it. And one of the most interesting stories of 2019, and it had been leading up to this for a few years, was just the massive box office flops of movies that went woke. And that's the problem with the Western too, is like I said, it actually went woke long before woke was a term. That genre was kind of the first to go woke. Is way back in the 60s, it started having this revisionist anti-Western attitude creeping into it, and that's what ruined the Western. I think that there's still some life left in the genre, and obviously Red Dead Redemption has been a very successful game, second only to GTA, I think, in terms of big hits, certainly for that studio, but in general it's a huge smash hit. Although I think that Rockstar isn't quite sure where to go with it, and I think that they have swallowed too much of the revisionist nonsense, and so they kind of unthinkingly regurgitate it because they just don't know any better, because that's all that they have. I think what they really need to do is return to the classic roots, and then maybe get the revisionist look. One of the things that I think was a key concept of the revisionist and especially the spaghetti Western was the look. And instead of people wearing these super clean, bright and polite, nicely pressed clothes, you had people who looked like they lived on the frontier, and you had towns that looked like they were on the frontier. And I think that was something that was actually the visual style was one of the few things that the revisionist and spaghetti Westerns really got very, very right, and it was a good thing that they did that. And I think having, kind of tougher, edgier main characters is not a problem, although I think having everybody be an outlaw and a scoundrel is tiresome after a while. And I think the idea that, everybody that you come across is, either angry or harboring some, corruption, perversion, or secret is also absurd, and that's something that kind of suffuses the game a little bit too much. You can't go anywhere without running into somebody wanting to just gun you down for riding by you on your horse while they're also riding their horse or whatever. There's some of these kind of revisionist anti-Western themes that could be surgically extracted, I guess, from Red Dead, and it would make the franchise significantly better. But that's kind of how the Western started and how it evolved, what happened to it, how it turned into literally the opposite of what it was, even though it was still set in the same setting. It had people who visually, well, actually, that's not even true either. They didn't even look the same, because they went from this kind of stylized, very clean look to a deliberately, probably exaggerated dirtiness look to many of them. And this exaggerated harshness, and everybody's unlikable, and this very cynical, pessimistic, anti-American view kind of took over the Western and poisoned it from within. And Rockstar has kind of managed to straddle both the Western and the anti-Western and make it more or less successful. They've made it successful. I do think that it could be better if a lot of that anti-Western, revisionist Western nonsense were surgically extracted. Certainly it would be better to American audiences. I don't know what, I know that they have a lot of sales elsewhere too, and I think that other regions and countries probably would be indifferent to some of that stuff, but I think in America in particular, the constant woke criticism of America is starting to get tiresome, and I'm starting to see, and maybe I'm a little too optimistic, but I'm starting to see backlash against it, and it's happening big time at Hollywood. It's in the news right now as we speak on Left 4 Dead 2, or and some other stuff. So I think that there's a chance that the day of anti-American screeds posing as entertainment is going to be over, and I think Rockstar could do well to get out in front of that trend and say, let's make a real Western, not an anti-Western, or let's revise whatever we're working on to kind of get rid of some of this stuff that is in the future, I predict, going to be seen as very offensive. And in a sane world, it would be offensive now, but we don't live in a sane world. We live in clown world where people pay to be insulted, at least in America. So anyway, that's my story of the Western and its relationship to Red Dead. We'll see where it goes from here.